Hi, everyone. Welcome to our quarter three webinar for our members. We're going to do a Farm Bill overview today. Very happy to have you join us today. So I just want to go through a couple of housekeeping notes. So everyone on the call is muted so that we can eliminate background noise. But if you have questions that you want to address, please go to the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen and you can type them in. And we may, depending on the questions and if it's relevant to what we're discussing in the moment, we may bring them up during the presentation, but we will certainly have a Q&A section at the end and we can make sure we get to all the questions. And if you can't stay for the whole thing, don't worry, this is being recorded, so we'll make it available to you in the member resource section of our website in probably a couple of days. So with that, I think we will get started, and I will turn this over to our Executive Director, Alexia.
Thank you, Christine. So yeah, I'm Alexia Kulwiec at Farm to Consumer Legal Defense Fund. Thank you all for joining us for this discussion about the Farm Bill. Joining us today will be Antonio Tovar from the National Family Farm Coalition. And so you can get a couple of different perspectives on priorities under the Farm Bill. I will also be speaking about the priorities of Farm to Consumer Legal Defense Fund, as well as one of our key allies, the Farm and Ranch Freedom Alliance. And so thank you for joining us, and I certainly do hope that you type in questions as you have them. So I wanted to start out with just sort of an introduction. We all use this terminology, the Farm Bill, as though this is sort of a monolith. And I just wanted to say what it is it's a series of separate statutory changes. It's kind of a grouping of legislative changes that happens approximately once every 5 years. So it's not really one bill or one law, but a group of laws put together in this, what they call an omnibus legislation. And it started with supports back in the 1930s at the time of the Great Depression, when agricultural prices fell dramatically, and we wanted to ensure that farms were still growing food and providing it to citizens of the country. And then what happened was this was initially passed in the early 1930s. Then we saw passage of something called the Agricultural Adjustment Act of 1935. And the Agricultural Act of 1949. And what this has done is essentially ensured that Farm Bill provisions are now permanent. And so what that means is that typically every 5 years or so, Congress takes a look at all of the agricultural programs included in the Farm Bill and makes modifications at that time. So when we say the Farm Bill, we're really talking about a series of laws that are passed together. Okay, and so Christine, if we can go one more slide. Great, thank you. So typically what we see is in the laws that are passed as part of the Farm Bill, they last about 5 years, and they will include an expiration date to the different statutory provisions included in the Farm Bill. And so that's why we say it comes up approximately every 5 years for changes. The 2018 Farm Bill expired September 30th, so just a few days ago. Many of the provisions were extended into mid-November of this year. I suspect we will see another extension of time as to those provisions into 2024 at this point. But certain provisions passed in 2018 were set to expire, which is why we needed to pass a new Farm Bill. One other thing that I'll say is that some of the provisions in the Farm Bill are passed through appropriations measures. So not everything expires in that 5-year period. Some things do and some things don't. So I just wanted to sort of give that quick intro to the fact that this is where the Farm Bill came from, and this is really how it works. It's not one big law, but it really is the time that policymakers take a look at agricultural policy, and that stakeholders such as yourselves and some of the organizations working on these issues can weigh in, right? And so changes can be made to the Farm Bill at any time. One more slide, Christine. And but in practice, most changes occur with the Farm Bill cycle. In other words, it's just easier to get congressional attention and try to make these changes at the time that the entire Farm Bill is being discussed and considered. So it seems to be the time that we get more active in terms of potential changes to agricultural policy. Yeah, so that's really all I have to say on that. So if we could go one more, Christine. Thank you. So essentially what I wanted to do with this slide is just introduce you to everything typically that is included in the Farm Bill. So the Farm Bill is split into 12 different titles, each covering, you know, a different sort of topic in agricultural and farm policy. And so you'll see all of the titles. It includes commodity programs, which are price supports, right? So some payments to farms if there's been a change in price levels, or changes in revenues. Those are programs under the commodity programs that support commodity farmers. We see Title II conservation. This can include payments to farms for taking certain agricultural lands out of agricultural use and trying to conserve the properties, regenerate the properties for environmental concerns. And then Title III, we have trade. Title IV is nutrition. And I've included here, this is actually the largest percentage of the Farm Bill is support for nutrition in this country. So our SNAP programs, other food support programs for disadvantaged folks will all fall under this Title IV. So there's been some discussion over the years of should this be part of the Farm Bill? When we look at total Farm Bill spending, it looks like there's a lot more spending on agricultural policy than there really is, because the largest chunk of this does fall under the SNAP or nutrition benefit programs. But in any case, it continues to be part of the Farm Bill today. Then we see provisions on credit, rural development. That includes a lot of broadband efforts these days, forestry, energy. Title 10 to our members can sometimes be interesting. This is where we could see some support for what's called specialty crops, which just means fruits and vegetables. And that's always kind of killed me that that's specialty and that our grain crops are considered the main crops in the country. But we're starting to see a little bit more support for organic agriculture and a little bit more support for vegetable and fruit growth in the country. Title 11 is crop insurance, and Title 12 is a miscellaneous. The miscellaneous is where we see programs today that involve livestock. So in 2014, the Farm Bill actually included a new section for livestock issues. In 2018, it reverted back and put the livestock portions into the miscellaneous title. I pause to point this out because that's where Farm to Consumer Legal Defense Fund priorities are today. And so it's really going to fall under this subsection of the miscellaneous title, because our priorities, as we'll chat about, are really focused on meat and meat processing. Okay, and so just a couple of words on the process itself. Our last Farm Bill was passed in 2018. As I said, it expired. Many provisions expired September 30th. Some have now been extended into mid-November. We started seeing hearings in 2022 before the Senate Committee of Agriculture, Nutrition, and Energy for potential changes to the 2003 Farm Bill. I'll point out one hearing we saw this year in 2023 involved the Prime Act that we'll talk about in a minute, and that was before the House Judiciary Subcommittee. And so we're starting to see, I think when you see hearings about particular topics, it's more likely that there will be more discussion about that throughout the process of reaching a new farm bill. At this point, I don't suspect that we will see any kind of new farm bill legislation until sometime in 2024. So one other thought just on the process is legislators are introducing individual bills to be part of this group of bills impacting agricultural policy. So there's a lot that's been introduced under the rubric, so to speak, so far in Congress for the 2023 Farm Bill. And we'll zero in on just a few of those and some of our priorities that we have today. Okay, so from the perspective of Farm to Consumer Legal Defense Fund, we're really focused this time round with the Farm Bill on meat processing initiatives, right? So I said that falls under Title 7 of the Farm Bill, I'm sorry, Title 12, miscellaneous of the Farm Bill, where livestock discussions are had. And we really have two priorities at the moment. The first is the PRIME Act, which I know you've probably heard us talk about before, right? And the PRIME Act is the Processing, Revival, and Intrastate Meat Exemption. And what this law would do is provide that if you can bring livestock to custom slaughter facilities, right now, those facilities can only process the animals for the owner of the animals. So it's for personal consumption. You've seen perhaps that you can do things like have animal shares or sell a live animal to a consumer who can then have that meat processed at a custom processor for consumption. But what we can't do today as livestock producers, bring livestock to custom slaughter facilities, have the animals slaughtered, and then sell the meat from the custom slaughter facilities. The PRIME Act would change that. The PRIME Act would say that meat that is processed at these custom slaughter facilities can be sold in the state where the custom slaughter facility is located. And so this would allow a real improvement to small producers that struggle to get into USDA meat processing facilities or state facilities, for example, and it would allow them to go to these facilities, have their livestock processed, and sell that meat. One thing I just want to point out about custom slaughter facilities is that they are still bound by federal standards. So they're regulated. There's certain requirements about how the facilities operate. The main difference between a custom slaughter facility and, say, a USDA facility is that they do not have an inspector on site for each slaughter of an animal. But there are certainly regulations in place to ensure that these facilities are clean and maintained in a manner that is safe. Then the other priority at the moment for Farm to Consumer Legal Defense Fund is a proposed amendment to the Federal Meat Inspection Act, which so is the PRIME Act, I should really point out. I'm going to back up one second and mention that under the PRIME Act, we saw this, we've seen it introduced in prior years. We saw it introduced as part of this farm bill by Representative Pengree and King in Maine and by Representative Massey out of Kentucky. And unlike other years, this year this law had 25 original co-sponsors, and now we're up to, I believe, 48 co-sponsors. So we are feeling very cautiously optimistic that we have a little bit more support for the PRIME Act today than we have in prior years. So you'll be hearing more from us on that. The other priority of the Farm to Consumer Legal Defense Fund is a further amendment to the Federal Meat Inspection Act, which involves really keeping the USDA more accountable to its dealings with state facilities and state policymakers. As it stands right now, if you bring an animal, you can go to a USDA slaughter facility, or to a state inspection facility. Typically, state inspection facilities, you can then sell the meat within that state. There are some states that are part of an interstate shipment program, and you can do that. The thing about state facilities is that federal law provides that these facilities can operate in a state as long as they are equal to or greater than the federal standards for facilities. So in other words, a state inspection facility has to at least meet all the requirements of a federal facility and maybe even more stringent requirements. And the USDA operates this program to decide whether state facilities are equal to or greater than federal facilities in terms of its regulations. The amendment that we're looking at, that we're working on, would put more of a burden on the USDA to establish if it wants to make changes or repeal a state's equal to status, that it has the burden of proving that the state is not in compliance. And so the reason for this amendment is largely we see if a state is involved in policy to try to help smaller producers, such as some programs we've seen for personal exemptions in Vermont, for example, or out west, we've seen some meat share agreements. The USDA may talk to a state policymaker and say, you have to get rid of this program because we don't think it satisfies the equal to status under federal law. And it frankly just scares state policymakers away, who then don't want to pass any kind of new program, even though they're trying to help their smaller producers. This amendment would put a burden on the USDA to establish how and in what way a state program is violating the federal standards, and that they should lose equal to status. Kind of a lot of words to say that, but essentially puts more of a burden on the USDA before it can simply threaten to revoke equal to status to state inspection facilities. Okay, and so from the perspective of Farm to Consumer Legal Defense Fund, we'll talk about, you can find more information on both of these priorities on our website. I'm sure you will be receiving additional action alerts from Farm to Consumer Legal Defense Fund on those, and we'll be still trying to make some additional policy changes as time goes on. I wanted to point out a couple of additional priorities and things that have been discussed by some of our allies during the Farm Bill process. So Farm and Ranch Freedom Alliance out of Texas is a very close ally of ours who is unable to join us today. But I wanted to point out some of their priorities, and FARFA's website is a wonderful source of information on these laws or proposed bills as well. Some of these Farm to Consumer Legal Defense Fund will be also pushing for, and some of them may be slightly different than our priorities, but I thought was important for folks to know are being debated as part of the Farm Bill. So similar to Farm to Consumer Legal Defense Fund, FARFA is in fact interested in meat processing reforms. So FARFA is also pushing for the Prime Act that would allow sales of meat from custom slaughter facilities. They're also taking a look at and supportive of something called the Strengthening Local Processing Act. And what this does essentially was provide more resources to smaller processors and would include some grant funding to expand capacity at some smaller processing facilities, or to even build some new small processing facilities. So these will be very helpful funds and very welcome to expand smaller facilities, although it's something that would take more time. And if we can get the Prime Act as well, custom slaughter facilities that are already up and running could be used. So we really are focused there on the Prime Act. FARFA is also taking a look at something called the Fairness for Small Scale Farmers and Ranchers Act. And what this does is really makes some changes to current antitrust law. as many of you know, we seem to have 4 major meat packing companies in the country, and they really dictate policy, volume, and control the market in a lot of ways. Similarly, in poultry and in pork, there's only a few major suppliers and major processors that have been controlling the market. So this law does take a look at antitrust, maybe provides provisions for even undoing some mergers that have taken place, or at least blocking some mergers as we go forward, mergers of meat processing facilities in the country. And then another piece of legislation as part of the Farm Bill that's been introduced is something called the opportunities for fairness in farming. And this really gets at the checkoff programs. So both for livestock producers, but also in other industries, farmers are very often required to make checkoff payments through their participation in a particular market, right? And then those payments go to organizations that engage in practices to promote the product at issue, whether we're talking dairy or meat or poultry, for example. But small facilities, or small producers rather, that have really been growing in a regenerative fashion, or who have really focused on humane raising of animals, for example, their priorities have not been represented by the organizations that take the checkoff monies and lobby for industry. So what this particular law would do is it would put in some transparency so that farmers could see where their money was going. It would provide for some audits to determine where that money is going, and provide for more voice to farmers to have a say-so in where some of this money is going. And I believe it changes some of the lobbying rules under the checkoff rules. In other words, makes some changes to what money can be used for lobbying efforts and what monies cannot. So that's one other thing we're looking at. And then these last two, there are a couple of measures that are in the works, so to speak, that would support regenerative agriculture. And the first is one that it creates incentives for managing crops differently. And so one of the things about converting, say, from a conventional crop to more regenerative practices is that conversion can be very difficult. And so this would provide some financial incentives to support crop tillage practices, soil management practices, et cetera, that would help regenerate the soils. I think also maybe capture some carbon. And then finally, some training for regenerative agriculture. Some funds for training in regenerative ag would be included potentially as part of the Farm Bill. And so again, these are other priorities by Farm and Ranch Freedom Alliance and one of our big partners. And at this point, I'm going to ask Antonio to come on camera and join us again. And he'll speak to the priorities of the National Family Farm Coalition. Antonio, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for having me. I just want to say that the FARFA, it's also one of our members, and what is their priority is also our priority. You point out to some of these issues. The National Family Farm Coalition is a 37 years organization, and it was born on the crisis of the 80s, and unfortunately that crisis is continuing because there's a lot of consolidation. Like you were saying, especially in the meat industry, that's something that it's unfortunately making a lot of small farmers getting out of business. The same is happening in dairy. Dairy is one of our main interests, because there's a lot of concentration on dairy, and the checkoff for dairy is one of the problems because it is supporting more concentration. So in fact, I was going to add something in the chat. a note that was in the Hill about the checkoff on dairy precisely. So we have the Meal for Family Dairies Act. This is a proposal that we have been circulating in the Hill, but it has not have so far traction. One of the reasons we suspect is precisely because USDA has a lot of leverage and has a lot of discretion in terms of which programs they are supporting and which are not. Meat is one of those examples. At the same time that they are supporting and they are being very aggressive to create more small meat processing plants, they have been very aggressively preventing small farmers to process their own meat. And that's the discretion they have, and that's why we are trying to change the laws on meat packing, processing, but also in dairy. In dairy, there is an incentive pretty much for processing plants to get some of the money that is allocated for crop insurance. There's a program that it have a overpay for when the dairy when the meal is the price is too low. So the one who gets more of the big checks for that compensations are the big producers, including the processing plants. So the other big issue, and that's again linked to concentration, is land access. And this is a problem that is growing also because there is investing firms that are buying farmland as a speculative way to get money. So these are not people that is interested on farming. They are more interesting on speculating with the land. So there is in this line, we actually have a bill, which is the Farmland for Farmers Act, was introduced by Booker, and it's to prevent corporations to own land. There is not a reverse on what they already own. It's just a preventive measure so they don't accumulate more land, because the farm should be for farmers, not for bankers. And the other piece important for all farmers is, besides having land and have a fair competitive market, is to have credit, because it's a very risky endeavor to do farming. So many farmers require credit, and many times the credit that they are looking, especially if you're a small farmer, is not going to be in the traditional bank. So USDA have a farm credit system, but unfortunately that system has been polluted with favors to some kind of farmers. So beginner farmers, BIPOC farmers are the ones who are facing more challenges to access those credits. So we are proposing a reform, and there's also legislation. There's a piece of legislation that was introduced by Senator Gillibrand, and it's also in the House by Representative Adams. It calls the Fair Credit for Farmers Act. Those two pieces of legislations are introduced. We hope that they are going to move forward. That's going to depend a lot on how the Farm Bill, like Alex already put it, the Farm Bill expired on September, just a few days ago, and they had to find some resolution. We might not see a Farm Bill until next year. So we have some time to advance the farms that are a priority of FARFA and our bills that we think will make competition and also a better access of consumers of fair food through these bills. And the Inflation Reduction Act is something that it's already passed. I know it's in there, but it is important that to take into account that right now with all the infight that is happening in Congress, there's important cuts on all the different lines that were already approved. So we need to always keep an eye on those risky cuts. And I will stop there. I know that we are on time, like we're running a little bit behind, so I'm going to stop there.
Antonio, thank you so very much. I'm going to, again, encourage folks to type in any questions that they have. We did make sure that we have time for that. And if there's not questions, I can go back, and I think we both can discuss things a little further. But we wanted to leave plenty of time. So please do type in any questions that you've got. So I think I'll take just one step back. And so to say, so again, what we're looking at is a series of bills that are being introduced that could become law as part of the Farm Bill. I think both Antonio and I have posited that potentially we're not going to see this change until sometime in 2024. And you'll see that we've entitled things 2023 Farm Bill. Things have expired. So we're in this interesting period. Some things have been extended. They might need to be extended again. And what we are worried about are appropriations and funding for important programs, whether that means supporting small meat processors, whether that means supporting education and resource availability, all sorts of things that the funding aspects may be expiring and not in operation while we're waiting for the next Farm Bill. So I wanted to point out as individuals what kinds of things we can do. And Antonio, I invite you to jump in and add to this as we go on, but what sorts of things individuals can do. And if any of you are online from other organizations, also what organizations can do. And so, of course, first and foremost, most important thing folks can do to help is to contact your federal legislators to support these actions, right? And so from the Farm to Consumer Legal Defense Fund point of view, you will see this link on this slide would bring you directly to a news article that we have on our website that talks about both the Prime Act and this amendment, this other amendment to the Federal Meat Inspection Act that would place a burden on the USDA. So I encourage folks to go to the Farm to Consumer Legal Defense Fund website. Under the news articles, you can find information about both of these laws. And particularly, I think with the Prime Act, we have information about figuring out who you can contact and how you can contact folks to weigh in. We will certainly be sending additional action alerts and encourage folks, when you see those, to open them and to go through the process of figuring out who your legislator is and then call that legislator, right? Phone calls are much more productive than emails. And so, like we said, there's 48 co-sponsors right now for the Prime Act. Maybe take a look and see if your rep is one of them. If not, perhaps call them and say you really want them to support it, whether they become a co-sponsor or simply support the legislation. That goes a long way. We've already seen one hearing for the Prime Act. We may see more. So if we see another thing scheduled for that, we will be in touch, and we might be looking for folks, smaller producers, for example, with experiences with the problems in meat processing, right? So we may need folks to be witnesses at hearings to suggest, yeah, I can't get into USDA facilities, or it's 5 hours away, or I'm not being given appointments until the following year. We know that those sorts of things are certainly happening, right? So I would urge folks to make calls to their representatives. We'll continue to inform you from Farm to Consumer Legal Defense Fund, and I encourage you to look into that. The Federal Meat Inspection Act amendment, I will say that we have been working on that along with FARFA and National Family Farm Coalition, and rural Vermont has really been spearheading a lot of those efforts. So I also encourage you to go to the FARFA website and the Rural Vermont website, which will give you more information on this proposed amendment. We're still looking for a sponsor, so it has not, I don't think, Antonio, been officially introduced. And when it has, or if it has, we will certainly be in touch, and also wanting folks to reach out to their legislators in support of that. Similar to Farm to Consumer Legal Defense Fund, on the topics that we mentioned that are top priorities of FARFA, I would encourage you to go to their website, Farm and Ranch Freedom Alliance. I see Christine sort of like pointing out that link. Thank you. They also have information and systems set up so that you can find your representatives and determine who you should be contacting to support those individual pieces of legislation. And then Antonio just went off camera. I'm going to ask him to come back and speak to, from his perspective, what folks can do to support these legislative efforts.
Yeah, first, let me tell you that I think that for this specific farm bill, I think that we have a great opportunity, because I think that the number of people, for instance, that has grown, or the legislators that have supporting the Prime Act, it is a result of the COVID pandemic. I think that everybody realized that the problem of concentration is that make our system very weak, because everything it's just a few people really dominating our access to food. So I think that the pandemic actually give us the opportunity to steer the wheel of the Farm Bill to the right direction. And the right direction is to support small farmers, is to support local production of food. Right now, the United States is importing 50% of their fruit and vegetables. So that's something that we can change. It's not that there's not enough land to farm. We were self-sufficient before, so we can be self-sufficient again. What we see right now, at least for the from the point of view of the National Family Farm Coalition, there's two challenges. The first one is dairy. Dairy is going to be something is going to be very difficult to change, because unfortunately right now at the USDA, the current Secretary of Agriculture has represented the dairy industry for many years. So there's a little bit of, there's not much room in there to try to have a more fair dairy system. And the other big challenge is going to be the access to farmland. And that's for other reasons. That's because Wall Street is not going to stop on terms of investing on farmland, and in other parts of our food system. And I'm going to cite, for instance, the attempts now to do big aquaculture, something like CAFOs in the ocean. That's something that we are also following closely, because there is a risk also to the corporations to pretty much control also our seafood system. So we have members that are fisher folks, so that's why we are following that. And I'm going to end with something that I think is correlated with all the issue of meat processing and meat consumption, and that's the country of origin label, which it is very important, because right now consumers, we don't really know where our meat is coming from. Right now, it's legal for to have a to have your meat have the label product of the United States, while the cattle probably was born, raised, and even slaughtered in another country, and then come to the United States, is processed in the United States, and they put the label like it is a meat from the United States. I think that's something we have it before, and then it was stripped out in the 2018 Farm Bill. So that's something that we want to return to have enact. And one more thing that FARFA is also looking, and many others, is the proposals to make mandatory electronic tax for cattle, which is not fair for small producers. It is a big expense that a lot of right now, the big fight also in the Farm Bill is going to be all what is data. Data is becoming our enemy in terms that having all processing and having all digitalized is not necessarily always good, because the same investors, let's put Big Gates, who owns most of the farmland in the United States, right now it's also very interesting on monitoring all what is food production. So that would be more control to what we consume.
Yeah. So, if I may, Antonio, I think I have a couple of comments to piggyback what you've said, and then maybe one question for you. First, a comment just to piggyback when Antonio talked about the country of origin labeling. Changing those rules is part of this fairness for small farmers bill that's been introduced, and that is one that is listed in FARFA's priorities. So if you're more interested in that, it really is astounding to me that you can say it's a product of the US just by repackaging meat that's been processed already in another country. But that is labeling is certainly something that can help American producers, you know, as they're trying to sell their local products, right? So that is part of that bill that's been introduced. Or something else I was going to comment on that it hasn't come to me. Maybe it'll come back to me. I do have one question for you, Antonio, which is, I'm curious about more specifically what you're trying to change in the dairy industry. We do have members that are producing for, say, Horizon or Organic Valley. So I'm wondering if you could just give a little bit more detail on what kind of changes you're trying to accomplish in dairy.
So the reality of dairy is that we are overproducing milk. In organic, it's not as bad as right now in conventional dairy and conventional milk, but we have mega CAFOs, concentrated raising dairy production. So that has given a like overproduction of dairy. And the other thing that is happening hand on hand is that people is consuming less dairy, at least less milk. So they are trying to find their way out by exporting dairy, but that's going to damage some other markets. That's going to also impact small dairy producers in other parts of the globe. So it's not really a solution. What our proposal in specific is looking for is a supply management system. What is that? That's something that is actually was very normal in the 50s, 60s, 70s, in which you pretty much manage how much you produce and how much you consume, so the prices don't go and sink. Because right now what it happens is the price of dairy is very low because we have too much supply. And the way to manage that overproduction of dairy is m- mainly to reduce the production on the large scale producers, because that way it is less concentrated. Small dairy producers will keep good prices, sustainable prices, so they can survive.
Right, got it. Thank you. And I should probably add, just for our members, right, at Farm to Consumer Legal Defense Fund, many of our members produce and sell or manage herd share arrangements for raw dairy. That's not part of what Antonio is speaking to. And in fact, at the state level, transitioning to those kind of operations is something that could really help. So for example, I'm sitting in Wisconsin, and this overproduction problem is leading some of our farms to say, well, I want to cut back. I don't want to produce into the mass market. I want to convert for my community to have raw milk available. And what we've seen at a national level can be helpful in trying to change some of those state legislation, right? I do want to point out the Farm Bill is specifically making changes to federal laws and federal programs. And typically what you see from Farm to Consumer is we do a lot of work at the state level and local level. So we're not talking in this webinar about things like the state changes that perhaps we can be working on. I did want to return to and piggyback to something else that Antonio said, because I remembered what it was, which is there is an opportunity this time around because of what we saw during the pandemic. And I think what I specifically want to just touch on is specifically to meat processing. Our food system has been vulnerable for quite some time, right? We have been controlled by a very few number of meat processors in this country. But what happened during the pandemic is when we saw these really large processing facilities have to shut down, we recognized the vulnerability, or at least more people started to recognize that vulnerability. And so what that has led to is, in a lot of ways, a recognition that we need to decentralize meat processing, to have more but smaller facilities. And that is behind really the strengthening local processing bill that's been proposed, but also allowing for the custom slaughter facilities. So it isn't interesting as a producer, if you're talking to a legislator, pointing out that folks want locally produced food, and that going to a USDA facility or even a state facility can very oftentimes just be a burden that you can't overcome in terms of being able to produce local food and provide that, right? So I do think learning about this vulnerability and having this opportunity to talk about it right now is really important. We see that same vulnerability in other potential policy areas, like encouraging cottage food production, for example. Now, we've seen those changes happen at the state level. We saw more people producing and selling food, say, from their home kitchens during the pandemic. And I know there's a real push to continue opening up those markets and decentralizing the food system. That's mostly happening at the state level. But I just wanted to point out the pandemic has, in fact, I think, brought a heightened effort to looking at local food systems and a decentralization of our food system. And we do want to take advantage of that and trying to make these changes. So at this point, yes, thank you, Christine. I'd really like to hear from some of you. We did kind of a really quick crash course in what the Farm Bill is and what we're seeing in terms of proposals that are being made. I'd really like to know what questions folks will have. While you're typing in questions, and I know you will, right? I'm also just going to go back and mention one thing that may have become clear during the webinar. When I take a look at the Farm Bill titles, it's commodity crops and trade, right? Some research in forestry and energy. A lot of these things are not things we know that Farm to Consumer Legal Defense Fund members are involved in. A lot of the Farm Bill programs are really geared towards sort of large crop production in the country, maybe some research programs to help folks, focusing on trade, so selling American goods elsewhere. So a lot of this is not your small family farms that's at the National Family Farm Coalition or at Farm to Consumer or FARFA, but is really geared towards the larger agricultural industry. And so it's really not sort of the regular policy issues that we are super engaged in. That being said, there is, a lot of room here. There's room for making changes for land access. I think that is a really important one that Antonio has raised. We do have some of our members involved in conservation programs. And if we can push for additional support for specialty crops, additional support for smaller meat production and meat processing, that could really go a long way. So it's an interesting, I think, place for us to be, because it's a lot of the policy that's typically engaged in as part of the Farm Bill is not about small farms. But we can take advantage of this opportunity and really start to make it more about smaller farms that are actually diversified farms trying to grow food in and for their communities, right? And I think we're seeing a renewed interest in that from the policy perspective. So, okay, do we have any questions? No questions? Comments?
I guess you were extremely thorough.
I guess so. Antonio, other thoughts or comments you may wish to make?
Question just came in too, by the way.
Okay, great.
Yeah, we are aware of Hagerman's proposal, and we are in support of it. I think that it is interesting what is happening in DC, because for some issues regarding conservation, for instance, we obviously have more support from Democrats. And when we are talking about meat concentration, like, we actually are having more luck with Republicans. I think that there is always room for negotiations, and hopefully we come with a farm bill that it's going to support conservation and also a more fair share of the market, because that's what it is.
So, and I want to say one thing about in answer to this question as well, which is this question being, and if everyone can't see it, the animal ID question, right? Antonio has mentioned this electronic ID that the USDA has been trying to require on all livestock producers. And I want to first point out that it shifts some economic burdens onto the farmers and ranchers, whereas with the not old fashioned, but the regular tags that folks normally use, that's provided, right, through veterinarian offices, and it's not at a cost to the producer. And so that's one thing about these electronic IDs that are problematic. The infrastructure expenses are a problem. But in addition, the way it is organized would allow these large producers that have, I don't know, 10,000 animals, that can just come under one application or one number because they never leave the land. They're not going out on pasture. And so it's a real, essentially, it's creating a process that is much easier and cheaper for larger producers as opposed to smaller producers. And that's a real problem. The amendment to defund the electronic ID tags, that was really part of legislation that was introduced in this time period about whether we're going to have a government shutdown, and there were some amendments into some of the funding legislation. I don't know exactly where that stands, but I do know that there was an amendment to say any funds going to the USDA could not be used for this electronic ID program. So I don't know exactly where that stands now that, you know, that the government is up and running at the moment. But what I will say is that this idea of the electronic ID tags is still a priority of ours, and there will still be separate policy efforts made around it. And so that may be one that you'll hear from us on. What can we do? Call your representatives, tell them you do not want these electronic IDs, and explain the problems with electronic ID system to your legislators. Because just because it's in that amendment, the issue is not going away, I think, is what I'm really trying to say with way too many words. So,
About the second question, I don't think there
Yeah.
is any specific legislation in play.
Okay, and again, I'm not sure if everyone can see all the Q&As, so I just want to make clear there was a question about using or directing farmers to use a specific product appeal. Am I saying that right? I'm not even familiar with it, on produce. And Antonio, you're saying you're not familiar with any such legislation. Okay.
It's some safety coding, as I understand, that creates a barrier between the fruit and any other dangerous elements.
Got it. Thank you. Let's see. So we only have a couple more minutes. I think, Antonio, any other just sort of last overall thoughts or comments about the Farm Bill process or priorities you might like to add?
I want to piggyback what you're saying about large production, because that's where most of the Farm Bill goes. And it's in correlation also with SNAP, because SNAP, a lot of the money that goes to SNAP is like a circular money, because it's food that is not always the best kind of food. And obviously we are in here through many, many years of bad Farm Bills. So we shouldn't really expect that this is going to change from one day to the other. But that's what I say. We can steer the wheel to try to go to the right place. But we shouldn't also think that we are going to like see a very, very progressive Farm Bill. I think we can move in that direction, and we have an opportunity to do it for what is happening right now in the Hill, and hopefully we keep going on that direction.
Yes, thank you. Agreed. It is a tough it's a tough battle, right? Federal policy has not really been as supportive of the smaller diversified farms as we would like to see, but I agree there's opportunities for some changes here. This is not going to revamp the system, right? 2024, but if we could make at least some inroads to policies that would help our folks, I think that would be tremendously helpful, and we will continue to look for opportunities. You will hear more from us on opportunities to contact legislators, to be involved in the process. If there's any other organizational representatives on the webinar, I also encourage you to take a look at this amendment to the Federal Meat Inspection Act. Specifically, I would suggest you go to Rural Vermont's website and sign our petition, because we want to show that organizations are involved in this issue as well as individuals. So, but with that, if there are no other questions, I think I will just say, keep on the lookout for us. We will reach out again when there's an opportunity to be involved in the process and contact legislators, and try to see if we can make some small changes that, like Antonio said, would really help our smaller diversified farms. So if there's nothing else, I think that is it for today, and I thank you all so much for your attendance.